Hello, welcome to the PowerPoint on Romantic Realism for English 160, Introduction to Literature. So let's define it first. And basically, Romantic Realism is a blend of the characteristics of Romanticism and Realisms. Some of the writers of Romantic Realism include Joseph Conrad, who wrote some great short stories like The Secret Sharer, and also wrote Heart of Darkness, on which the movie Apocalypse Now is based. Then we have Fyodor Dostoevsky, some nice fun Russian literature, and then Liam O'Flaherty, who we are reading in class. So let's talk about Romanticism first and see what that's all about. So we have to go back to the late 1700s, and that's where we see this literary and intellectual movement originating, and especially in Europe. Pretty much the United Kingdom, England, was the birthplace, and it spread mostly because most of the poets of this era moved themselves around the world, especially into Italy, and you see a lot of their influence in Italian culture. It moved through the late 1800s and eventually peaking between 1800 and 1850. Some of the famous writers that wrote in the Romantic spirit include Lord Byron, who we looked at his poetry earlier in the semester, William Wordsworth, Percy Bysshe Shelley, who was married to Mary Shelley, the woman who wrote Frankenstein. We have Herman Melville, who wrote Moby Dick, the longest book ever about fishing. Just kidding. Jane Austen, who is been named by several critical organizations the best female writer of all time, and Washington Irving, one of our great American writers, plus all of our Gothic writers previously discussed, such as Edgar Allan Poe, the Bronte sisters, and so on. The elements of Romanticism basically define what it is. And it is this moving away from the Enlightenment, that logic and reason are the most important things, and rather moving towards this perspective that emotion, intuition, were very, very important, and if not more important than our logic and our reasoning. So we're going to start off looking at how it focused on the common man, not on the spectacular man, the man who was above everyone else. This celebrated the common man and childhood. Romantics believed in the natural goodness of humans, which is complicated by urban life. So life out in the country is far more pure and simple and easy than it is within a city environment. Romantics also believe that the savage, the primitive man, is the noble man, and that childhood is innocent and pure. There was also, as I mentioned, a strong sense of emotion, feelings, the senses, so you see a lot of imagery in this kind of writing. Romantics believe that knowledge is gained through intuition rather than deduction. And being melancholy or sad was just as important as being happy. And at the time, there was a disease called melancholia, which in a modern day parlance would probably be closest to something like depression. And then there was also the morbid and grotesque fascination, and that's where, again, we have talked about Gothic literature previously. There's a picture of Lord Byron, one of our great Romantic poets, looking very melancholy in his own right. There was also this awe of nature. And when you go to England, you can go to a place called the Lake Country, and it is all these beautiful countryside with lakes and trees, very much similar to what you see in the picture at the bottom of the slide. And the Romantics stress the wonder of nature and the experience of inspiration through connecting with nature. So in the United States, we had a similar movement when Henry David Thoreau wrote about Walden Lake. So this idea that nature takes us much more to our spiritual sense of being. And today, a lot of people who climb mountains and walk hundreds of miles across England, which is a very common tourist activity, again, feel this awe of nature and this overwhelming sense of belonging to the earth. They also adored the primitivism of old days. They believed that people were more authentic then. So when you hear or see people talking about the good old days, this has been going on for a couple centuries now. And, keeping in mind that the good old days also did not include flush toilets, electricity, music that could be played on demand, or even, God forbid, our phones, then a lot of us today are probably not as enthralled with the good old days. There was also the celebration of the individual, and Romantics elevated the achievements of the misunderstood, the heroic individual outcast, the guy who doesn't fit in like a cog in the machine, keeping in mind that during this time that Romanticism was flourishing, you also saw the Industrial Revolution, and as such, to a certain extent, the elements of Romanticism were in a way to demean or to subjugate this idea of the Industrial Revolution of mankind, where, we're all just an element of this giant machine. More importantly, they also saw the individual consciousness and the individual imagination being more important than the problems of society. So the person is more important than society. Now, interestingly also is towards the end of the 19th century or 1800s, you saw the rise of Marxism, which basically illuminated the idea that the individual is not as important as the well-being of society. So we're already beginning to see, before Romanticism even dies out, this switch to the value of the group rather than the individual. There was also the focus of imagination. Romantics legitimized the individual imagination as a critical authority. Our imagination is so much more important than logic and reasoning from their perspective. And they believe that only through imagination can we find truth. So now we're going to move on to realism, which in many ways seems like the exact opposite of Romanticism. But when we look at romantic realistic literature, you see elements of both. And more importantly, they're seamlessly connected so that the message, the story tells us, the tone, the setting, the theme, are all conscripted under the service of blending these two very paradoxical ideas to create their own meaning. So realism is also known by some as naturalism. There are very slight differences between the terms, so for the purposes of our class, we'll look at it as the same concept. It was developed during the late 1800s and early 1900s as a response to this romantic idea and kind of a rejection of the Romantics. And it's an attempt to represent subject matter truthfully, without artificiality, and avoiding artistic conventions, implausible, exotic, and supernatural elements. So it really takes away anything that's not something you can see, hear, touch, taste, or feel with your senses. So some examples of literary realism. We have Middlemarch by George Eliot, whose real name is Marianne Evans. And as I had mentioned in class, women weren't often published in those days. So a lot of women took on male names to get their work out there. Robinson Crusoe, which is based on a true story written by Daniel Defoe. Most of the novels of Mark Twain are very realistic, including the dialogue and how he uses the Southern colloquialisms to really define his setting. The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane, about a very cowardly man being forced into battle. The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, about the depression of the early 1900s. White Fang, which is an adventure story. And if you are a big fan of the great outdoors and you like animals and cold weather and all of those scary things, you would love this book. And then last but not least, of course, we have The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton, which really looks at the social mores around the upper classes and the middle upper classes of New York City of the time period. So some of the elements of realism include the setting is very specific. The time period and the historical details are very accurate. And again, there's no need to put any magical elements or supernatural elements. The idea is that realism is scary enough without all of these other things added on to it. It's usually set in an urban or city environment, and the language is common and concrete. You don't see a lot of personification and flowery language. It's a lot of simple and compound sentences that represent the reality, the dirtiness of the world. Especially when you read something like Moby Dick, it can get tiresome because everything is so dark and depressing. Other aspects of realism include the fact that people are motivated by lust, not love, greed, and material things. And the limitations of social class and poverty are emphasized. So you don't see people who are well off, rich. I mean, you do in some of these, but for the vast majority of the stories, the emphasis is placed on the disparities between the rich and the poor. Another aspect of realism includes the details, and they tend to be very dark and negative. If you think back to the poem we read by Robert Frost called Out, Out, about a young man who accidentally cuts his hand off and then dies in the middle of the field. The idea is just, this stuff happens and there's no happy ending. And that's really a key component of realism. The climax is not a crisis, it's just one more fact. So oftentimes the dramaticness of a particular situation is underscored because it's just another negative, depressing element in these people's lives. And with that said, not all stories that follow the realistic component are depressing. Middlemarch, for example, is one of the great novels of all time. And despite the realistic aspects of it, it's ultimately a very rewarding and uplifting read. Another aspect that came out of the romantic realistic movement is the idea of the anti-hero. The anti-hero lacks the conventional characteristics of a hero, but still managed to do something of consequence. So, a conventional hero is admired for his bravery, his strength, his charm, his ingenuity. But an anti-hero typically is clumsy or selfish, sarcastic, and has a personal flaw that prevents them from being truly heroic. And if you think back to the great Star Wars movies, the originals, Episode 4, 5, and 6, and you think of somebody like Han Solo, he is the perfect anti-hero. He's sarcastic, he's selfish, he doesn't really want to help, but he feels compelled by guilt in some ways, and personal gain. The great moment of anti-hero is in Episode 5, when Han Solo is being lowered into the cask of to freeze him, essentially, and Princess Leia blurts out that she loves him And it's this great moment of just absolute waiting for it to happen, all of us waiting for him to respond to her. And he says, I know. And that's the perfect anti-hero response to being told that someone loves them romantically. So that'll finish up this conversation about romantic realism. We are, if you have any questions or you have something you'd like to discuss, please text or email me. And otherwise, have a fantastic day.